we're going to begin our third session, which is called Crafting the Future. It will be a freewheeling exchange of ideas, and it'll be moderated by Ms. Sangeeta Prasad, with Mr. Arun Maira, Lord Nicholas Stern, Mr. Vishaan Chakrabarty, Mr. Arun Nanda, and Mr. Rajiv Dubey on the panel. Let me introduce them one by one. First, may I invite Mr. Arun Maira on stage. He has worked for 25 years in the Tata Group in senior management and board positions, and worked with Arthur D. Little Incorporated, the international management consultancy, from 1989 to 1999. He returned to India in 2000 and was appointed chairman of the Boston Consulting Group in India prior to joining the Planning Commission. He has consulted with companies across the world on issues of growth strategies and transformational change. He is the author of several books, including Transforming Capitalism, Business Leadership to Improve the World for Everyone, and Shaping the Future, Aspirational Leadership in India and Beyond. Please welcome Mr. Arun Maira. May I now invite Lord Nicholas Stern. Lord Stern is the I.G. Patel Professor of Economics and Government, Chairman of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, President of the Royal Economic Society, and Head of the India Observatory at the London School of Economics. Fellow of the British Academy, where he served as a president from 2013 to 2017, and elected Fellow of the Royal Society. He was Chief Economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and Chief Economist and Senior Vice President at the World Bank. He has published more than 15 books and 100 articles, and his most recent book is Why Are We Waiting? The Logic, Urgency, and Promise of Tackling Climate Change. And I'm sure many of you know that he's the author of the landmark Stern Report. May I also invite Vishaan Chakrabarty, who delivered an excellent talk on designing resilient cities earlier in the afternoon. Let me introduce to you Mr. Rajiv Dubey, who is the Group President of HR and Corporate Services in the Mahindra Group. Now, I must tell you beforehand that whatever I'm going to share with you is a tiny part of everything that he does. Because if I tell you everything he does, Vishaan will miss his flight. So he has a big role to play in business as a member of the Group Executive Board, as a chairman of 3 of our companies and a board of another 3. He heads key functions like group communication, government relations, CSR, and infrastructure. If you think after doing all this within the company, he doesn't have time to do things outside, I must tell you that he is a member of the governing body of the International Labour Organization. He's on the board of International Organization of Employers, and the chair of the policy group of that organization. Top it all, he's also a thespian. You should see him doing Shakespeare, Mr. Rajiv Dubey. Joining them on stage, Mr. Arun Nanda, who you heard earlier in the conference about all the wonderful things that he does. We're glad to have you again on stage, Mr. Nanda. And to moderate the conversation, Sangeeta Prasad, the Managing Director of Mahindra Life Spaces. Sangeeta, incidentally, has been a speaker at multiple editions of the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, has been to COP21 at the 8th Clean Energy Ministerial, and is an active member of the FICCI Smart Cities Committee, and a well-respected speaker on sustainable urbanization. You can guess that this is going to be a great conversation. Over to you, Sangeeta.
Good evening. My God, everyone seems to be somnolent just now. Good evening. Right. So, for me, this evening and the early afternoon has been very, very fascinating. Some of the things I hold dear to me are coming alive in all the conversations, and some of the things I've discovered I never thought about came forth in today's meetings and today's deliberations. And I would like to, before I start, go back to one of my favorite poets, John Keats, and talk about how he defined resilience. Because I think a thing of beauty is always a joy forever. And I will just like to quote a few lines from here. Its loveliness increases. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases. It will never pass into nothingness. Mark my words. It will never pass into nothingness, but still will keep a bower quiet for us. This is the spirit of intimacy and being with oneself, and a sleep full of sweet dreams and health and quiet breathing. So why do we have to define resilience? When we have people like them defining it for us in such a meaningful and simple manner. It is all about we as individuals, it is we as society, and I would therefore like to step back after the confabulations of this evening and say, and ask each of these persons, the eminent persons who are on stage, what does resilience mean for them? And before I do that, I'll just spend a 30-second on why this topic is an imperative for us today. The topic is imperative. Someone spoke about data. We are in the emerging countries, we are 30% urbanized. In the developed countries, we are so-and-so urbanized. Urbanization is the key to all solutions. And if we have to make that the only solace and salvation for us, we have to become sustainable. But my worry is, if we have to become sustainable, do we have the strength? Do we have the power? Do we have the inclination? Do we have the willingness and the resources to become that? And that's where, when we conceived this chapter of Confluence, resilience came from. As Mr. Nanda said earlier, resilience is about bouncing back. It is also, I think, about stepping back, reflecting, and acting. It is about feeling, thinking, and doing. So I would, without much ado, request from that side on, and Dr. Arun Myra, to talk about, if he had to define resilience and talk about the most important factor, what is resilience all about, I would like him to talk about that.
Thank you. A resilient system is a system which has inside itself the capacity to improve itself, and you said about continuously becoming more beautiful, continuously learning and improving itself. It is able to react to unexpected shocks outside itself and build again inside itself capacities to deal with such shocks which might arise in the future. It's a complex, self-adaptive system. I contrast this with an engineered system. And some of us who are engineers recollect that the fundamental law in mechanics, engineering, is the second law of thermodynamics, which says that a complex system's entropy will inevitably increase over time. In other words, its resilience will reduce over time if it's engineered by someone outside it. If the system is managed by people inside, there's the possibility of the system to be complex and self-adapted and therefore resilient. And this will connect to some of the ideas we have about who governs the city.
It's all from within. How do I adapt myself around the ecosystem and make ourselves relevant and not redundant? Thank you. Lord Stern.
I want to describe what I think resilience depends on, and I think it depends on the same things as sustainability. It's not the same thing, but it is closely interwoven. And both resilience and sustainability depend on the strength of our assets. And it's also the system and how it's put together. But let me, in order that we don't all say the same thing, let me point to the key assets that are involved in both sustainability and resilience. And that is human capital, physical capital, natural capital, and social capital. I think we know what the physical capital is, and we can discuss how strong and resilient that might be to the various buffetings that come along, of course, worse and worse if we don't manage our climate well. Secondly, human capital. If we have cities that I imagine a city where you can't breathe very well. I can't think where that might be. And that damages the human capital of the people, makes them less resilient. Natural capital is about our natural endowments, the trees and the forests and so on. And cities have to breathe in the same way as less urbanized rural areas do. Great potential in the natural capital of cities and its waters and its air and its green space. And social capital, of course, is about the cohesiveness of society, the trust in the authorities, and we quickly start to unravel if we have conflict and strife within the community and if we do not trust the systems they're in. So those four capitals are absolutely essential to sustainability and essential to resilience in slightly different ways, but also in very similar ways.
So while we get to Vishaan, I just had a thought that just the first question is about the key factor of resilience which you all think about, but don't think I'm going to let you off easy, because I'm going to request you all, in your wisdom and experience, how those factors shape up and make the cities and our urban ecosystems resilient in future. But that will be next time on. So first is, what do you think is resilience all about in urban ecosystems?
So I think I already spoke to some of this earlier, but I would just add to those two very excellent definitions the idea of community and how important community is to the idea of resilience. And what I can give you a very specific example of where this didn't happen, which is these yellow vest protests that we saw in France recently, which were, triggered by a gasoline tax, a carbon tax, which many people have been talking about for many good reasons. But I think that we run the risk of, in an effort to be sustainable and resilient, that if we don't understand the sort of grassroots community issues that bear upon those kinds of ideas, it will fail. That by itself will not be a resilient policy mechanism. And so understanding how it is, community from the grassroots up thinks about resilience, I think is, and the recapturing of the streets, I think, was one of the best examples that we saw today of this. It won't work, right? And so this is why it's critical to think about it at every scale of the community ladder.
So community and belonging, humanity and human scale. These are what encapsulates your definition of
Exactly. Yes, the human scale thing I spoke about earlier, obviously,
yes,
so I didn't
I'm
want to
just
repeat
taking-
myself.
I'm
Yes.
stealing some of your ideas, actually.
All right.
Yes, Mr. Nanda.
The three professors here, and I'm a dumb accountant, so I'm the wrong person to start, but I will articulate something little differently from the way I look at it. I think Dr. Bhattacharya touched upon it also. I think the problem is that there is a lot of talk happening at the policymaker level. Government has primarily trying to fix problems on the hand because vote banks are more important, nobody is there. And in the process, what he said, nobody is talking to the grassroots. And I think we have to look at the problem. I only hope that things like Confluence help to bring all stakeholders together. Because unless the policymakers, the government, the grassroots people, the public at large, the community, let's call it the community, and the implementers, I think you also need agencies which will implement it to work together. I think we are working in silos. So on one hand, a lot of creative work is being done in the universities, and we are not seeing much of it happening. I mean, I feel sad as an Indian, after 70 plus years after independence, people don't have, you look at our slums, you look at waterlogging, you look at dirt on we talk of, you just walk out of a five-star hotel and you'll see, somebody showed the pictures of Maggie noodle. I mean, if you go to Shimla or something, the hill slopes are covered only with plastic. And it's not that people don't understand. I think we are working in silos. And if you really want to get cities to become resilient, if I was a decision maker, the first thing I'd do is get all four, including the implementer. Because if you don't have the implementer, he will say this is theoretical and it cannot be implemented on the ground.
Great. I think it reveals our take on confluence. If you see, all of you sitting here are a mix of academics, practitioners, doers, thinkers. So that's what it is all about, all of us including the audience, and that's why the Lead the Change module was there in Confluence, where we got Anup, we got Renuka, who are actually leading and implementing change. Now, Mr. Dubey, your work in ILO is all about bringing the labor and making it more resilient, more productive, more humane. So I would like you to bring that perspective in your definition of resilience.
So I would say resilience is about overcoming fear and leveraging failure, and for cities to ensure decent work and social justice for those who are at the bottom of the city and of the economic pyramid.
Thank you. That was short and very, very subtle and sweet. Now I will turn the tide a little. We have all understood what resilience means and much more. I have some paradoxes in my mind. Capitalism was a much repeated word in today's discussions. And the other word which ran in tandem with capitalism also starts with C, community. I'm very intrigued and I'm very tempted because I have people sitting here who are policymakers, who are creators, who are practitioners. So I would like to know, Mr. Myra, capitalism and community, how do they work together? Do they really work together or do they have parallel journeys? And how do you then make cities and urban ecosystems resilient? Your take.
Well, thank you. You know, someone introduced me as doctor. Then you just now mentioned that they're academics and professors, Arun, you said. Well, frankly, in urbanization, I'm still a learner. And when I got to the Planning Commission and the Prime Minister said, urbanization shall be your subject. And urbanization, as we keep saying, is going to be the biggest challenge for India. And India is the country with the biggest challenge in urbanization in the next 30, 40 years. So what is urbanization I have to think about? Well, we're talking about inclusive growth. And we all say theoretically, and Shishir was a great teacher to me, that urbanization enables growth to happen. The question is growth for whom? And the history of cities, remember Charles Dickens' times, people come to cities because they need livelihoods and jobs, some way to earn incomes. So if the city is a vehicle for the improvement of the conditions of mankind, for whom is this vehicle? This vehicle is for those who don't have opportunities. And they come scrambling into the city looking for opportunities. So when we talk about for whom is the city, it is for them. It is for them. But when we talk then about what should the city be like, that it's a good city, who do we ask? And I learned this in the Planning Commission. Well, I get urbanization, then I get Shishir, one of our world's greatest thinkers on this subject, the World Bank, UNDP, Rockefeller Foundation, all keen to teach us because we need it. But I said I also want to learn from the people on the ground. So let's ask the young people to organize themselves meetings at which they would discuss what they think is the solution and invite me to sit and listen. And I realize this, that the way we go about thinking about what's good for the city, we have to remember something which comes out of the world of ecology, that think about the species that is disappearing. If the environment is not good for that species, it's a bad environment. But we man have begun to think the planet is for me. So it's that ego about the planet is for me. When we come to the city, as Mahatma Gandhi said to policymakers about everything, please think about the poorest person that you can think about. Is this policy going to be good for that person? So in determining what should be a city like and what should be done to improve the city, we are not asking the people on the ground who really have the solution because they're scrambling. They know what is the frugal resource that is available because they have to use only that. We are asking people with a lot of insights and knowledge to tell us about how the city is improved. So I come back to what I said about a complex self-adaptive system. vis-a-vis an engineered system. We have a tendency as experts to engineer things for the benefit of others. And we're doing the same for cities. Experts in, well, I'll tell you the best model for a city and let's engineer it for you. Of course, when we get into a city which is already a living thing, it's difficult to impose your model on them, and therefore we like a green field. Get the slum dwellers out of the way. Give me all the space and I'll create some world-class city over here. But the city is for those people actually, and not for my ideas. And so this is a lesson I really did get, that be very humble and keep clear about you as a policymaker, I as a policymaker, for whom are we doing it, number one? And please listen to them. They have the needs better expressed than I can say this city would be good for you. They know what would be best for them, as also solutions, frankly. So a city is a learning system. To your words about loveliness increases and it's resilient and increases. But the learning is not an outside-in expert shoved in. That's not a learning city. That's a being taught city, and the school doesn't learn. It is inside, and we have to learn from the city. We have to learn from the people in the city.
There is learning and listening, and we then deliver services and products. So again, I'll take that paradox of mine, capitalism and community. We heard a perspective from Dr. Myra, and who better than Mr. Nanda, who has been in the business of creating businesses and cities. How do you think capitalism and community, do you see them as parallel? Do you see them working in tandem? And can we contribute successfully to the city?
Do you know that I do your appraisal? You're asking me difficult questions. You forgot. Putting me on the mat in front of so many people. I said putting me on the mat in front of so many people. You know, why do you say capitalism and communism? Community. Can a capitalist survive without the community? You know, I personally feel from the question that this mental barrier has to be removed. Now, let me put myself into the hat of somebody who's associated with this business of real estate. Now, why do I create? What do I think? As my dear friend Arun said, you know, you need to have the humility to think of the lowest of the lowest, because that is the lowest denominator is what will actually matters. You know, I might think I own the land and I'll build the city, but it's the slum dwellers for whom the city has to be built. And you know, if I have to think of here and tell you, I think one of the most important things, or the effective thing these think tanks and NGOs can do is to bring the community and capitalists together, because they have to work in tandem. I'll switch for a minute and take the example of Mahindra Group. Let's take our group, what we can do for resilience, for example. Now, as you know, that we have moved from, we were one of the first movers in the electric vehicles, even in the electric scooters. I think Zenzi was probably the first electric two-wheeler that came into the market. And we're looking at electric vehicles. So you are working on it. But how do you get that to the masses? And this recent tie-up with Uber, because one of the problems with electric vehicles, the cost. And so I'm saying if you start thinking like that, but one thing which we are not doing as industry, which we need to do, is the advocacy part of it. I think there is a lot being done, but we can move to the next level. One of the nicest things I saw when this gentleman made the presentation, that because of his effort, Maggie is now taking back the thing and giving some noodles against that or something. You know, can we play the role of doing that whole 360-degree turn? What do we do with the automobile after it is finished? Now, my friend deals with resale market? How do we take to the end? So I'm saying that one of the things that I would like policymakers, or more than for government policymakers, I'm talking of the think tanks and the others, to bring the two together, because they cannot survive without each other. You need somebody to buy your products, and you need somebody to make the product. You need a consumer for a producer, and a producer for a consumer. And I think we have to align our needs into this. You know, I wish instead of the 2% CSR, which is compulsorily put on people, if there was more thing done voluntarily, thought through, it'll probably do better for the community. Sorry, I can't be as crisp as you.
So you are talking about problem solving, you are talking about listening and learning. So they are all leading to what? Are we sensitive? Are we empathetic? Do we feel and then think and then do? Rather than just doing things for the short-term benefit of certain stakeholders. And I think this is a good forum. There are so many of you sitting here. Mr. Nanda has actually reached out to us and said, can we catalyze the community needs and the capitalists coming forward and working to solutions which help? I can see Dr. Myra wanting to share a few thoughts.
I didn't answer your question. I thought I'd duck it also and let my friend Arun answer it, but he also was ducking it actually. We are talking about, but let me now take it straight on. You said about capitalism. The capitalist corporation, the limited liability corporation, has been created as a selfish citizen by design. Limited liability means what? I have the freedom to make mistakes and do things, but I will be secure within my limited liability, okay? Every other citizen we are talking about in society must be responsible and accountable for whatever resource they use of the environment. So it's not the human beings, and they are lovely human beings, but the form of the institution is by design a selfish institution. And so we come to this situation that when the community is supposed to be a community of citizens who care for each other and manage the commons together, here you introduce into it an entity. I'm not saying introduce Rajiv Dubey into it, introduce a limited liability company into it. The responsibility of the people who run the company has to be, as the role they play, accountable for the benefits to their shareholders. So it is for the owners and it's for ourselves that we must manage. The business of business must only be business. I mean, this is a paradigm that is going on. And I'm saying that many of us are saying, we've got to change that. And we can't just change human beings inside. We have to change the construct of this paradigm. Otherwise, you will find that the gorillas, when they come in the room, that is the corporates, they find it a very difficult conversation, or the others find it a very difficult conversation to have with them. Because they would have to say, you know, I'm here to take money and so on. So we are wishing to have people open up their minds to say, I'm also limited as being an NGO. You are also limited by the structures that you have. We need to talk about changing the structures within which we work, and not just changing ourselves as human beings.
Sorry, if I may just come in. I think there are 2 or 3 questions that capitalists are asking themselves. Number 1, can we really be competitive unless we are equally fair and inclusive? This is a hardcore, self-interested question, nothing to do with philanthropy. Because of the nature of the world, it's a VUCA world and there is a pushback. So can we really be competitive over even a medium term, and definitely in the long term, unless we are fair and inclusive? And number 2, and I know you love this, is labor really a short-term cost to be minimized, or is it one of those rare assets that actually appreciate over time if you invest in it? And pure cost-benefit analysis may suggest, and there is evidence emerging, that the answers to both these questions is, number 1, you cannot be competitive unless you're fair and inclusive. Number 2, actually, the cost-benefit works in favor of investing in labor. I thought I'd just put it because you asked about capitalism. Yes. And I think the nature of capitalism is changing, even if profit and profit optimization, maximization, call it what you will, is still the objective. I thought I'd put my 2 bits in.
I'll go to Lord's turn, But I just wanted to agree with you because today the investor and the customer is asking for it. The fairness and inclusivity, we will not have someone to serve if we don't become fair and inclusive. That's what we are seeing. I know, Dr. Mayra, you have some deep thoughts in that, but I'm sincerely saying, as maybe a little younger person who is seeing what is happening, we are seeing some seeds of change. And Lord Stern, you had some thoughts as well on this subject.
Yeah, it's not about whether capitalism or not, and it's already been raised. This is about forms of capitalism. So if we're going to abandon capitalism already, do you have something else in mind? So the question is forms of capitalism. When we think of capitalism, we think essentially about the private ownership of most of the means of production. And we think about markets allocating resources. So just to be precise about what we're talking about, and I doubt if anybody would advocate abandoning all of that. Various forms of abandoning all of that have been tried, and they haven't done terribly well. So it's forms of capitalism. Now, if you ask yourself the question, do we mean that all means of production should be privately owned? All means of offering up, consumer services should be privately owned? I think the answer to that is a very loud no. And it's very important about where we talk about the no. And social housing seems to me to be of fundamental importance if we're talking about dealing with homelessness and slums. One of the big mistakes we made under Mrs. Thatcher in the UK, there's a long list, let me just pick only one of those, was to sell off council houses. The result is that our social housing in the UK has been run into the ground. Are you surprised that we have so many homeless people in the UK? And so many people living in very decrepit places. Secondly, education and health are of fundamental importance for it to be socially, communally supplied, and so too many aspects of transport. Well, social housing, transport, health, education, that's a pretty big part of the economy. So in that sense, we don't mean pure unadulterated capitalism with everything privately owned and privately supplied. So we have to think of what it is that makes for cohesion, what it is that gives people a chance. Well, education, health, transport, and housing are a very big part of that process. If you now ask about the behavior of firms and how far that's consistent, or could be consistent with a decent community in a capitalist economy, then again, and we touched on it here, the behavior of firms is very important. So I started with what areas of the economy are likely to have very big communal ownership or public ownership. We can talk about the forms of that. But also the behavior of the firms is of fundamental importance. And my great friend Colin Mayer says that the purpose of the firm is to find profitable solutions to the problems of people and the planet. I like that definition of the firm. Contrast it with Milton Friedman, one of the feeders of market fundamentalism which deluded us in the UK and the USA in the 1980s and 90s. He said that the purpose of the firm is to maximize profits for its shareholders. I'm sorry. And it produces societies that don't function very well. And if you look at the performance of firms that behave according to that broader definition, to find profitable solutions to problems of people on the planet, they do very well. Like, you all know about Unilever because has a very big presence in India. I've worked very closely with Paul Polman over the last decade, and we're co-chair of the Global Commission on Economy and Climate, and so on. And you know that they are very careful about looking after their employees, about their production lines. I'm sure they're not perfect, but they're very careful in that direction. They get 1.8 million job applications a year. 1.8 million. They get the best people. Firms that get the best people are going to do better than firms who don't get the best people. They have customers who trust them because they behave reasonably. So what we're learning, and the evidence is really mounting now, it's not just the environmental side where I do most of what I do, it's beyond that. And there's now a very big association between responsibility and good returns for shareholders. And it's hardly surprising.
So just to get in on this, and to bring it from macroeconomics back to cities and resilient cities for a second. So I think the debate isn't capitalism versus community. I think it's, you know, what Dr. Stern just, it's about whether we believe in neoliberalism versus other forms of capitalism and what that means for community. And I think, as somewhat of an outsider here, it might be, I'm going to be very optimistic for a second and say that India is in an extraordinary position to help the world right now. You know, the United States and the UK are in the worst state I think we've seen in their histories. And it's this very question. Neoliberalism, the religion of Reagan and Thatcher, have torn these societies apart. And it's going to be very, very difficult to understand what is the glue that's going to pull them back together. So now go out to the rest of the world. Brazil is a mess. Venezuela is a mess. China is a command and control economy. India sits in a very, very interesting moment. And I think that this whole question of cities and what we do is something that the world can watch and learn from. Now, you all are very close to it, so you may not see that. You look at the pollution on the streets, you look at the air quality, you look at the congestion, and you've got to be saying, Vishaan, what the heck are you talking about? But I think in all of that, if you heard what Dr. Sachs was talking about, there is tremendous opportunity for this nation to lead right now. And in terms of what it does with its cities, in terms of how it balances capitalism and community, it is probably, I would argue, of any major nation in the world, in the best position to lead the world.
I just wanted to add here that what I'm getting to, I'm taking a takeaway from this conversation, delightful conversation, is if we have to build resilience in the urban ecosystem and we see firm behaviors, as in I mean different kinds of firm behaviors, not firm behavior, we have to, your point, Dr. Myra, of adaptive and adaptability, firms have to adapt because the needs of the society around is changing, and firms are becoming more and more adaptive. I would take it not as a negative, but as a positive, that if we don't become adaptive and a self-adaptive engine, firms will cease and the society will not flourish. So I would take that as a takeaway for us as firms, and I hear that, and you know, thanks to Lord Stern, you were very incisive in your inciting into shapes and forms of firm behavior rather than making it a unidimensional one. So I would like to shift the conversation a little because I'm taking that takeaway, and the question which comes to my mind is another paradox, because I'm trying to solve paradoxes in my mind, I think on behalf of the audience, so that we have some concrete takeaways when we go back. And again, I will shift from the letter C to a letter E, which is ecology and economics. We all know, whether it is Mission 2020, whether it is the COP21, signing the science-based targets, which we as Mahindra Group have been one of the first movers, you know, getting climate positive. The question which sometimes gets asked is there a paradox or is there a convergence on, or yes, is there a middle path? I would like to hear, I'll go to Lord Stern first and like to understand from your experience, what is this ecology and economics all about as we go on building resilience?
If there appears to be a clash between economics and ecology, it's usually a clash between bad economics and ecology. And the understanding of how societies and economies function has to take into account not only what you use to produce what you produce and your relationship with the person who buys that, but also the consequences of your actions for the community as a whole, and of course the ecology in that community as a whole. And we have to do many things to make our economies and societies function well. We don't do all these things perfectly, but we're getting a much deeper understanding of what we have to do. So, for example, if what you do and the way you produce really damages somebody else, then it's very important that we either price that or stop it. So if driving your diesel car into a city kills children through the pollution that it produces, my first preference would be to stop people driving diesel cars into cities. You can price it, you can price most things. And for some problems, the pricing is good. Congestion charging, for example, is a very good method of combating congestion. But they're both examples of economic policy which is designed to take into account the consequences of our actions for other people. And that's a very important basic in economics. It's about getting markets to work well. As I say, it's not always through prices and taxes. It can often be that. But it's also through good regulation. And good regulation in an economy with lots of uncertainty and increasing returns to scale can have a dramatic effect. I mean, take the banning of the incandescent light bulb in Europe. It was remarkable and an enlightened view of policy. And it didn't take very long for LED bulbs to come along. Of course, they were a bit expensive at first, but then, you know, with economies of scale and so on. And that's a clear example of a well-constructed standard or regulation pulling through under a capitalist system because it's clear on what it's asking. Very powerful, privately generated mostly, research and innovation. So I say, if there's a perceived conflict between economics and ecology, I think it's bad economics. Similarly, if we're looking at the ecological side, and I emphasize natural capital. For transparency, I'm on the board of Sanctuary here in India. If you think of our forests, I mean, they offer us fantastic control of water and supply of water. They prevent landslides and the mud coming down the mountains. Infrastructure is something that enables other activities to take place in a well-functioning way. Well, it's clear that natural capital is infrastructure. It supplies those services. So if we think about our ecology in an economic way, and we think about our economics in an ecological way, we don't do too badly, provided we follow through.
Thank you. May I take those ideas into our national level? Dr. Stern, I'm glad, put it into the perspective about ecology and the economy together. And I'm putting people also, the community, back into it. So they're all part of the system together. So here we are as India. We are doing very well if you take some aggregate numbers of the economy. Fastest growing, second fastest growing in terms of GDP. We do know from many indicators that we are not doing too well in the ecology, that's the environment. We also definitely should know that we are not doing very well on the social inclusion indicators, livelihoods, jobs, which cities should create. Overall, the country is not doing very well. Certainly, there's enough evidence around, no matter what the statistics and the debates about the statistics are. So we in the government, when we were in the Planning Commission, some of us said that, for us to measure whether we are doing right by the country, we should have these measures as a scorecard in front of us. And if we are accountable as a government, we should share that scorecard with the people. We keep talking about the economic measures. Well, we say because they're easier to measure, there's been a history in economics to measure those. The other two measures are more lately. Humanity has become conscious of the economy's effect on those two. They're not, but doesn't matter. If you say, like, we have to be a leader, We have to propose that we think these are good measures. The citizens will say, this is not an accurate measure. They'll tell us another. Then we have to use that or develop that and report it. Why can't we have a scorecard to the citizens which is on all four matters: economy, the environment, its ecology, the conditions of the community and livelihoods and incomes, as well as on the governance, some parameters. Why can't we honestly report this? I come to the corporations now. This idea that the corporations should engage with the communities and give them a report card about how much resources they are using has been around for quite a while. There's so many organizations been suggesting this. How many organizations in India voluntarily put this report out in a fashion that people can read it? I know there are at the backs of reports, I've read those. They go for pages and pages and arcane stuff. You can't understand it. It should be loud and clear that we failed. There's more pollution than we should be producing. Say so. Then you're a citizen equal to the others in terms of I'm accountable for the conditions of the community because I have greater power in creating these conditions and I'm accounting to you. So the adoption of an account to the citizens of things that matter to the community, we must take the responsibility as corporations to take the step. The government has once before tried, and you've been part of that, to get it a national voluntary guidelines, that these are the same things. It was devised by industry, along with NGOs and the Ministry for Corporate Affairs. But who uses it? Because it's made voluntarily. And when you talk about forms of capitalism, unless the capitalists change their forms and start to show that they are citizens, accountable for the condition of society and the environment, along with other citizens, there will be revolutions which will create, like we're having in our country. We're getting distortions of the economy. And you may call it what you like, but giving money out to people, maybe it's the worst form of socialism, just handing money out. But people need it. But is it going to improve the system, the resilience of the system? No, so. So I come back to, I think it's something about ourselves. It's not just about my being a good person. I change something about the way my institution is formed and the way it functions. We will not otherwise get a resilient society.
I'll shift track a little, and I have two questions. That's right. One for Mr. Dubey. Future of work, resilient urban ecosystems, how do they pan out?
Okay, how do they connect? Okay, so the future of work, of course, has many dimensions. One of them is the factor of migration. Migration, in this case, is the migration that takes place from rural to urban areas. That's going to be a huge phenomenon. And therefore, the future of work, which addresses work itself, the worker, and the workplace, all are totally tied up with the movement of people from outside cities into cities and how cities handle the physical part and the emotional part and the spiritual part, if you like, of this movement into the cities is a big, big connection between the future of work and the planning of cities.
As we go along, one of the things which we talked about was about technology. Technology was seen as, and I'll go to Vishan for this. Vishan, we have had a conversation earlier, and I see that technology is a much polarized subject. Some people really think it's the be-all and end-all, and some people dismiss it. I think there is a credible and a veritable path for technology being an enabler. How do you see in designing resilient cities, technology, please? Give me some examples, please.
Well, I'm going to quote my friend about how we no longer live in this world of either or, we live in a world of and. And so it is not that technology is either friend or foe. It is, we have to think about the themes of today. The technology that we designed the world around in the 20th century was the automobile. The automobile transformed human habitation as we know it. And we basically made a lot of mistakes. And many of those mistakes started in the United States under President Eisenhower with the creation of the federal highway system, the purposeful suburbanization of the country for a whole variety of reasons that had to do with race relations and the Cold War and a variety of other things. Technology has all sorts of unintended consequences. So beware the technologist that says that they've got the panacea, that they've got the cure-all. And in my world, what's interesting is when I started studying cities, no one studied cities. No one cared about them at all. Now, you can't swing a cat without hitting a conference about cities because it's such a hot topic. And what I find is that technologists have really entered this and said, cities are enormous markets. And so in those enormous markets, we can't just hide in office parks in Silicon Valley and Bangalore. We have to really start attacking cities and figuring out how we can fix them as a problem. And fixing them as a problem is exactly exactly the wrong way to think about. Cities are not a problem to be solved. Cities are something to be celebrated. Does that mean that they're perfect? No. And it does mean that we can use technology to make them better, and the way we make them better is answering to human need. So rather than saying, here's a cool new thing I invented, let's make everyone live, right, in a different way so I can sell my thing. We have to invent things that help the human condition. That's what technologists have to do. That is their charge. It is the same charge I have as an architect to look after health and welfare, that a doctor has, that a professor has, that an engineer has. That is the technologist's charge. We have to hold every technologist to that charge and not just fly off on these wild goose chases because someone's invented, the automated corkscrew. That's not important. It's what do human beings need?
Thank you. That was a very, very good take. It makes me feel comfortable also as a practitioner. So, after hearing all of you and listening to you attentively, I realize listening and learning is the most important skill and capability we take along with us as we move out of this room. And listening to whom? Listening to you and me, the human. The robot will come, but we will continue to live forever. Because that's the meaning of resilience, the resilience of human beings to bounce back. It is not about either or, it is about and. That I think you summarized it before the panel, so I'm stealing your idea. I'm actually stealing ideas from all of you. And the fourth, very important, it is for people like us who belong to different zones and genre to come together and find out solutions while listening and learning. And firms adapt and be adaptive and respond to the stimulus which the citizen is giving you. Otherwise, some firms will not continue and some cities will suffer. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, delegates.
So even as the panelists were speaking, we could hear little rumbles going through the audience as some people thought they were saying lovely things. So can we have a big rumble for them, please? May I invite Mr. Shailesh Haribhakti and Mr. Bharat Shah on stage to give mementos to some of the panelists, and I'll tell you who and why. They are both independent directors on the board of Mahindra Lifespaces, apart from being very eminent citizens of the country. You probably know that Mr. Shah had a very big hand in making HDFC happen, and Mr. Shailesh Haribhakti has a firm of his own, and I know as an independent director on the boards of many firms, he is actively trying to get firms to use ESG to do business better. So may I ask Mr. Haribhakti to hand over the memento to, oh, he's not here now, is he? All right, so Mr. Shah, it's all yours. So let's begin with Mr. Myra. Mr. Myra, Mr. Arun Myra. Lord Stern. Mr. Dubey. Vishan, you don't get any. You already have one. We don't want to add to your luggage. And despite the fact that, Mr. Nanda is the chairman of Mahindra Life Spaces. Let's give him one anyway. But Sangeeta doesn't get one. This is her conference. So thank you very much for a wonderful conversation.